The elevator was silent, but the air was screaming. I didn't need to look up to know that Julian Vance, the most powerful true alpha in Vancouver, was staring. I could feel his gaze, heavy, dark, and predatory, burning a hole right through the top of my son's dinosaur-themed raincoat. My scent blockers were failing. Underneath the clinical citrus, the scent of my fear, sweet, panicked vanilla, was beginning to leak out. "You're hiding something." Julian's voice rumbled through the small space like a low, possessive growl. He didn't look at me. His eyes remained locked on Leo, who was staring back with fearless, wide-eyed curiosity. Then, the CEO of Vance Enterprises did something the office legends said was impossible. He knelt. The most powerful alpha in the city dropped to one knee on the cold elevator floor, his charcoal suit wrinkling as he came eye to eye with my son. He took a deep, slow breath, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled the pup's pure, milky scent. "A pup," he whispered, and for a split second, the cold mask of the CEO shattered. "A pup? In my building?" I stood there, paralyzed. I was a single Omega with $400 in my bank account and a secret that was currently grabbing the CEO's expensive silk tie with a sticky, curious hand. I should have known the rain was a warning. Before I was trapped in this elevator, drowning in the scent of an alpha who could ruin me with a single word, the morning had started with a different kind of disaster. Rain has a sound in Vancouver that I've never heard anywhere else. Not a drumming, more like a held breath, soft and constant, like the city itself is exhaling through gray clouds that never quite lift. I used to find it calming. This morning, it just sounded like a countdown. "Leo, baby, we have to be quiet like a mouse, okay? Quiet as a little gray mouse." My son looked up at me with his mother's eyes, wide, brown, entirely too trusting for the situation I was dragging him into, and nodded so seriously that the hood of his dinosaur raincoat slipped down over one eyebrow. He looked like a tiny, damp arsonist about to commit the crime of his short life. In a way, he was. We both were. Daycare had closed for the holiday week without warning. A burst pipe, a flooded basement, a sympathetic but useless voicemail from Miss Patterson, and I had exactly $400 between myself and the home down payment I'd been chasing for 3 years. $400 and a quarterly report due at 9 a.m. sharp to a CEO who, by all office legend, smiled approximately twice a year and fired people for breathing too loudly near his glass office. I am an Omega. I have spent 11 years making sure nobody in this building knows that. The scent blockers cost more than my son's shoes, but they worked. Citrus sharp, clinical, nothing underneath but the smell of a man who didn't exist outside of spreadsheets. I'd built an entire identity out of being forgettable, low profile, quiet. The kind of employee nobody remembers in a hallway. It was safer that way. An unmated Omega with a toddler and no alpha in the picture was a target in a building like Vance Enterprises. Gossip, pity, or worse, interest from men who thought a single parent was an opportunity rather than a person. So I dosed Leo's little raincoat with my own blocker spray, tucked him into my oversized work tote with breathing holes I'd poked through the lining the night before like some kind of criminal mastermind of toddler smuggling, and prayed. The lobby was empty enough. The service elevator was broken, of course it was. Just the main one, baby, one floor, quick as a bunny. The doors opened on an elevator already half full, 2 paralegals from floor 12, a courier with a stack of boxes, and, because the universe apparently wanted to test exactly how much my heart could take before 8 a.m., Julian Vance. He took up more space than a man should be allowed to. Not just his height, though that was considerable, but something underneath it, an authority that pressed the air flat around him like weather does before a storm. Dark gray suit, the kind that costs more than my rent, jaw like he'd been carved by someone with a grudge against softness. I'd seen him in meetings, at a distance, like you'd see weather systems on the news. Impressive, slightly terrifying, nothing you ever actually wanted to feel. I kept my head down, pressed myself into the corner. Leo's small weight shifted against my hip where I'd hitched the tote bag higher, and I felt, not heard, felt, the soft, sleepy hum he made when he was deciding whether to behave. He decided not to. The blocker spray, I would learn later, breaks down with body heat. Toddler body heat, specifically, which runs about a degree warmer than an adult's and metabolizes everything faster, including, apparently, expensive omega-grade scent suppressant. I watched it happen to Julian Vance in real time. His shoulders, which had been set in that particular tired stone posture men like him carry into elevators, went rigid. His head turned, not toward me, not at first, but down, low toward the canvas bag at my hip, with an expression I'd never seen on a face that controlled. Confusion, then something rawer underneath it. I knew that look. I'd smelled it on myself in mirrors for 3 years, the particular helpless tenderness of a body recognizing something young before the mind catches up. True alphas don't get surprised. That's the whole myth of them. Control, command, the ones the textbooks said could scent-track a single distressed pup through a stadium of 10,000 people. I had never quite believed the stories until I watched Julian Vance's nostrils flare once and his entire carved stone face crack down the middle like ice on a lake in March. He smelled milk and warmth and something powdery soft underneath my own thin, citrus-blocked panic, and for 3 full seconds, the most powerful man in this building looked like he'd forgotten how his own lungs worked. Leo, sensing an audience the way only small children can, peeked that exact moment to peek over the edge of the tote bag, one fist closed around the strap, eyes huge and curious and aimed directly up the impossible height of Julian Vance, like he was looking at a particularly interesting tree. "Hi," Leo said, with the devastating sincerity of someone who has not yet learned that not everyone deserves a hi. I have never wanted a floor to open beneath me so badly in my entire life. Julian Vance, 6-foot-something, billion-dollar empire, terror of the 17th floor, looked down at my son and for one unguarded heartbeat looked young, like something in him that had been locked away a long time ago had just heard a key turn. The doors opened on floor 9. I didn't wait to see what expression came after that one. I murmured something about a forgotten meeting, hitched the bag tighter against my hip, and fled into the hallway with my heart trying to climb out through my throat, Leo's small bye-bye trailing after me like a confession I hadn't meant to make. Behind me, I swear I heard Julian Vance exhale a single word into the closing doors. It might have been, "Wait." I told myself I'd imagined it. I told myself a lot of things that week that turned out not to be true. I spent the rest of that morning in a kind of low, humming dread, certain that any minute a security badge would be revoked, that HR would call me up to explain exactly how a toddler had ended up in the executive elevator smelling like warm milk in a building that spent 6 figures a year on scent-neutral air filtration. Nothing came, no summons, no terse email, just the ordinary churn of spreadsheets and the unordinary, persistent feeling that somewhere above me, on a floor I never had reason to visit, a man was sitting at his desk thinking about a smell he couldn't explain and didn't want to. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a report due and a son tucked under my desk with a coloring book and $400 standing between us and the next 2 weeks. Whatever had cracked open in that elevator for half a second was not mine to worry about. I had enough cracks of my own to mind. I should have known better than to think one terrified elevator ride would be the end of it. Omegas talk about alpha instinct like it's a fairy tale told to scare children straight, but I'd felt it myself once or twice. That pull, that thread tied somewhere under the ribs that tugs toward a scent you've decided, against all reason, belongs to you. I didn't yet understand that true alphas felt it for pups, too. Not romantic. Older than that. Something closer to the bone. By Tuesday, I had a system. Leo got a coloring book and a juice box and strict orders to stay under my desk, which worked exactly as well as any plan negotiated with a 3-year-old, meaning it worked for 40 minutes. I was elbow deep in a quarterly variance report when I looked down, and the space under my desk held nothing but an abandoned crayon and a juice box leaking quietly onto the carpet. The particular silence that follows discovering your child is missing in a 40-story building does not exist anywhere else in nature. It is not panic, not yet. Panic comes a half second later, roaring up through the silence like a wave. I was on my feet and moving before I'd consciously decided to move, calling his name in a whisper shout that probably looked to my cubicle neighbors like a man having a small breakdown over spreadsheet formatting. I checked the break room first, hands shaking too hard to properly open the door. I checked the stairwell, the supply closet, the corner by the photocopier where he liked to press buttons he wasn't supposed to touch. Every empty space rang louder than the last, my own pulse hammering in my ears until the building itself seemed to tilt slightly. The fluorescent lights too bright, the recycled air too thin to fill my lungs properly. I kept thinking about elevators, about lobbies, about all the ways a building this tall could swallow a boy who barely came up to most people's knees. And I hated myself in that moment with a fierceness that had nothing to do with anyone but me for needing this job badly enough to risk him at all. I found him by following something I couldn't name. Not scent, exactly. Blockers were still mostly holding. But a kind of certainty, the same compass pull that had gotten me through 3 years of solo parenting on instinct alone. It led me, of all places, to the executive floor. The door to Julian Vance's office was open. I should have turned around. I did not turn around. He was sitting on the floor. Julian Vance, Armani, glass desk, framed magazine cover of himself looking exactly as cold as he looked in real life, was sitting cross-legged on his own office floor, suit jacket discarded over the back of a chair I assumed cost more than my car, sleeves rolled to the elbow, head bent in fierce concentration over a small plastic fire truck with one wheel hanging by a thread of red plastic. Leo sat across from him, tear tracks dried on his cheeks but otherwise wrapped, narrating the truck's injuries with the gravity of a surgeon. "It broke its leg," he informed Julian solemnly. "It needs a Band-Aid." "Trucks don't have legs," Julian said, not unkindly, turning the wheel over in fingers that I would later learn closed boardroom deals worth more than my entire neighborhood. "But I think I can fix this. Hold still for me." I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar, watching the most feared man in the building thread a paperclip through a broken axle with the focus of a surgeon, his jaw, that terrifying magazine-cover jaw, gone soft with concentration. "He wandered off," I said, too loud, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, every parental terror of the last 15 minutes collapsing into one sentence. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll have him out of the building within the hour. Please don't. I need this job, please." Julian looked up. Whatever he saw on my face made something in his own expression go very still and very careful, the way you'd approach something wounded. "He wasn't any trouble," he said. Quiet. Final, the way some sentences are when a man isn't used to being argued with. He held up the truck, fixed now, fire engine red, wheels spinning true. "I used to fix things like this for myself," he added, and something in the way he said it made it sound like a confession he hadn't meant to give two strangers on a Tuesday morning. Leo took the truck back with the reverence of a knight receiving a sword and immediately drove it into Julian's knee, making truck noises with his whole chest. Julian's mouth, that mouth I had only ever seen flattened into corporate neutrality, curved up at one corner, helpless like he hadn't given it permission. "You're not in trouble," Julian said again, looking up at me. And something underneath the words felt like it was asking a different question entirely, one I wasn't ready to answer, not yet. Not with my scent blockers thinning by the hour and my son using a billionaire's knee as a racetrack. I gathered Leo up, stammered something that might have been "thank you," and left before the office could see how badly my hands were shaking. By Wednesday, I'd stopped pretending this was sustainable and started simply surviving 1 hour at a time. Leo and I had found a corner of the break room that nobody used, behind the dead ficus, near the window that looked out over gray water and grayer mountains, close enough to the door that I could see anyone coming and pack us up in under 10 seconds. I had timed it. I was peeling the crusts off Leo's sandwich, the rain ticking steady against the glass, when a shadow fell across the table and every nerve in my body went taut. "This seat taken?" Julian Vance, in a $2,000 suit, holding a small white box that smelled, even through my blockers, unmistakably of dark chocolate and orange. He had skipped a board lunch. I learned this later from office gossip that traveled the way gossip does, fast and inaccurate in every detail except the ones that mattered. Julian Vance had canceled on 3 department heads to walk the floors of his own building, hoping, apparently, to stumble into a 3-year-old and his terrified father by accident. Of course not, I managed, which was a lie because every cell in my body was screaming that this was in fact exactly the seat that was taken, occupied by every reason I had for staying invisible. He sat. He was too big for the break room chair, knees nearly to his chest, and somehow it made him look less imposing rather than more, like watching a mountain try to fold itself politely into a teacup. "What's that?" Leo asked, already leaning, already reaching with the boundless confidence of a child who has never once been told no by this particular man. "Dessert," Julian said, and opened the box to reveal 4 small chocolate truffles, the kind I imagined were flown in from somewhere with a name I couldn't pronounce. He held one out on his palm like he was feeding something wild and didn't want to spook it. "Don't tell my pastry chef I'm sharing. He gets possessive." Leo took it with both hands and a noise of pure, unguarded joy. Chocolate immediately smeared from cheek to chin, and Julian laughed, actually laughed, a low, surprised sound like he hadn't used the muscles for it in a while and was relearning how. "I don't have to do this," I said quietly, once Leo had migrated his sticky hands and his truck noises to the window ledge, absorbed in watching a tugboat crawl across the harbor. "I know." Julian's eyes followed Leo before they came back to me, and there was something careful in them, something that wanted to be asked instead of telling. I wanted to. We talked then, not about the company, not about reports or quotas, but about nothing important and everything that mattered. He asked how old Leo was. He asked, hesitant, careful, whether his mother, and I told him simply that it was just us, that it had always just been us, and watched something complicated move behind his eyes that I didn't yet have a name for. I didn't know what to say about his gaze. I still don't, fully, even now. I just knew that something in me, the same thread that had pulled me toward my missing son on Tuesday, pulled taut again, aimed differently this time, toward the loneliness sitting across from me in a suit that cost more than my mortgage and couldn't fix the thing underneath it. Leo, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the moment, turned from the window and held his half-eaten truffle directly up to Julian's mouth. "Share," he announced, the way toddlers announce decrees, expecting the world to comply. Julian Vance, billionaire, true alpha, terror of the 17th floor, leaned down and ate chocolate out of a 3-year-old's chocolate-covered fingers without a second of hesitation, and something about the easy, unguarded gratitude on his face nearly undid me right there behind the dead ficus. Thursday was supposed to be quiet. Thursday was, instead, the day I learned that a determined toddler can find his way through a 40-story building with the singular purpose of an alpha sensing north. It nearly started badly. Mid-morning, I'd heard his voice in the hallway outside my row of cubicles, easy, unhurried, asking someone whether they'd seen the truck boy today, and I'd practically thrown myself and Leo behind the filing cabinets like a man dodging gunfire, pressing one hand gently over my son's mouth while he giggled against my palm, certain this was some new and delightful game. I counted Julian's footsteps coming closer, closer, the particular weight of his stride unmistakable even through the carpet, and held my breath until they finally turned, unhurried, toward the elevator bank instead. I didn't know then whether I was afraid of getting in trouble or because some smaller, more honest part of me was afraid of exactly how much I wanted him to find us anyway. I still don't fully know. I just remember my pulse hadn't settled by the time I let Leo go back to his crayons, and that some traitorous corner of me had been disappointed, not relieved, when the footsteps faded. I'd left Leo for 4 minutes, 4 minutes, I would repeat to myself like a prayer for the rest of the day, to walk a signed contract to the floor below. When I came back, the space under my desk was empty, and the particular bone-deep dread of Tuesday came roaring back tenfold. I found him through the glass wall of the executive boardroom. 12 department heads sat frozen mid-presentation around a table the size of my entire apartment, the air thick with the kind of silence that precedes either an explosion or something nobody in the room has a script for. At the head of the table, Julian Vance sat with my 3-year-old son perched on his knee, one large hand braced absently across Leo's middle to keep him steady, the others still gesturing through a quarterly projection like nothing in the universe had changed. "And as you can see," Julian was saying, voice perfectly level, perfectly commanding. "Q3 margins reflect the adjustment we discussed." Leo reached up and grabbed a fistful of Julian's tie, examining the silk with great interest. "Which, again, accounts for the shipping delays out of—" Julian glanced down, unhurried, and gently extracted his tie from my son's grip, replacing it with a pen instead, which Leo accepted as fair trade and immediately began chewing on. "Out of the Burnaby facility." Nobody in the room moved. I stood frozen on the other side of the glass, hand pressed flat against my own chest like I could hold my heart in place by force, watching the most feared executive in Vancouver run a high-stakes meeting with a toddler on his lap like it was the most natural configuration in the world. I should have burst in. I should have apologized, scooped Leo up, accepted whatever consequence was coming. Instead, I stood there, rooted, and watched Julian Vance glance up once, just once, and find me through the glass, and something passed over his face that wasn't apology or embarrassment, but something closer to pride. Like he wanted me to see this, like he was showing me deliberately exactly what kind of man he could be. The meeting ended 12 minutes later, ordinary as any other Thursday, except that the CEO of Vance Enterprises walked out of the boardroom with a sleepy toddler braced against his shoulder, one small hand still curled loosely around his collar, and not a single department head said a word about it, because I would learn later, they'd all quietly agreed it was the most relaxed they'd ever seen him in a meeting. "He's a good negotiator," Julian said, handing Leo back to me with a care that made my throat go tight. "Got me to agree to extend the Q4 deadline. I don't even remember saying yes." "You let him stay," I said, still catching up to my own heartbeat. "In a board meeting?" "He was happier with me than alone in a hallway." Julian's voice dropped, quieter, the corporate gloss falling away entirely. "I wasn't going to make him scared just to look proper for a room full of men who already do whatever I tell them anyway." I didn't have an answer for that. I just held my son a little tighter and let myself, for one unguarded second, imagine what it might be like to have someone who chose softness over the rules, even when nobody was making him. Friday was the last day before the holiday closure, and I'd promised myself I'd earn the year-end bonus that would finally tip my savings account over the edge into enough. Leo's school had a waitlist deposit due in January. The down payment I'd been chasing for 3 years needed $4,000 I didn't have. So I stayed. By 8 o'clock, the office had emptied to the hum of vacuum cleaners somewhere down the hall, and the rain against the windows, steady as breathing. The whole floor had gone dim and strange, the way offices do after hours. Half the lights cut to save power, the glass walls turning the city outside into a smear of gold and red taillights far below. The building settling around me with the particular creaks and hums of a place that wasn't built to be this empty. Leo had gone down sometime around 7, exhausted past arguing, curled into a nest of coats I'd piled under my desk like a small warm animal denning for winter. I worked with one eye on my screen and one ear tuned, the way parents learn to the sound of his breathing. I didn't hear Julian approach. I felt it, that thread again, tugging, and looked up to find him in the doorway of my cubicle, suit jacket gone, tie loosened, looking at the scene under my desk with an expression I didn't have a word for yet. "You're still here," he said, soft, like he didn't want to wake the small sleeping shape in the coat nest. "Bonus deadline. We're saving for a house. Daycare's not cheap and—" I stopped myself before I said too much, before 3 years of exhausted, careful invisibility could spill in front of the one man in this building who could end it with a single sentence to HR. Julian crouched, slow and careful to look at Leo properly, small fist curled near his cheek, dark lashes against soft skin, breathing the deep, untroubled sleep of a child who trusted the world enough to fall asleep on the floor of an office. "This is the most impressive thing I've seen all week," he said quietly, "and I closed a $40 million acquisition on Monday." Something in my chest cracked open at that, quiet and total, the way ice gives on a lake. Not a sound so much as a sudden, irreversible shift. "Let me drive you home," he said, straightening. "It's pouring. You shouldn't be hauling him onto a bus in this." I should have said no. I had a whole speech prepared for exactly this scenario. 3 years of careful, exhausted invisibility built specifically to keep men like Julian Vance at arm's length. Instead, I found myself nodding, gathering Leo's sleep-heavy weight against my shoulder, following the CEO of Vance Enterprises out to a car that smelled, once we were both inside, blockers thinning in the warm and closed air, like sandalwood and cedar, grounding and steady. The kind of scent that made something tight in my own chest finally loosen. Leo stirred once in the back seat, blinking blearily at the city lights smearing gold through the rain-streaked window, and murmured, "Truck man," before falling straight back to sleep. Julian's hands tightened just slightly on the wheel. He didn't say anything for several blocks. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "Nobody's ever called me that before. Truck man. I think I like it better than CEO." I looked over at his profile, lit gold and gray by passing streetlights, and felt the careful, exhausted architecture of my invisibility start, quietly, to come apart. My apartment was small. One bedroom that I'd given to Leo years ago. Myself folded onto a pull-out couch that I'd told myself was temporary, the way I'd been telling myself things were temporary for 3 years running. I hadn't meant to invite him. The words just arrived, unplanned, somewhere between thanking him for the ride and watching him linger by the curb like he wasn't ready to drive away. "Do you want to come up for tea? It's the least I can do." He looked at the building. Modest, a little tired around the edges, warm light glowing behind thin curtains, the way some men look at things they've only ever seen from a distance. "I'd like that," he said, quiet, like it cost him something to admit. I tucked Leo into bed first, watched Julian hover in the doorway of my son's small room, careful not to intrude, something unguarded and hungry in his face as he took in the crayon drawings taped to the wall, the nightlight shaped like a moon, the small, ordinary evidence of a life built around someone else's happiness. In the kitchen, kettle hissing low, he finally said it. "I'm an orphan." The words came out blunt, unrehearsed, like he'd been carrying them so long he'd forgotten how to soften them. "Car accident, when I was 6. I built this whole company, this whole life, and I don't actually know what I built it for. I come home to nothing. I've come home to nothing for 32 years. He turned his mug slowly between both hands, not drinking from it, just holding the warmth like he wasn't sure he was allowed to want it. "There was a foster family for a while, decent people. But I was one of 6 kids, and I learned fast that the way to be safe was to be useful, quiet, capable, not a burden. I got very good at that, good enough that by the time I was old enough to leave, I didn't know how to be anything else. I built Vance Enterprises out of that same instinct, I think. If I was successful enough, important enough, nobody could ever look at me again and decide I wasn't worth keeping." I set the mugs down between us, my hands steadier than I expected. "Why were you working so late tonight?" he asked, and I understood, somehow, that he already knew the surface answer and wanted the real one underneath it. "Leo's school has a career day on Monday. Parents come in, talk about their jobs, eat terrible cafeteria cupcakes. I've never missed one. I work these hours so I can take the day off without falling behind, so he never has to feel like I chose work over him, not even once." I wrapped both hands around my mug, steam curling warm against my face. Being a parent isn't really about the cute moments. It's mostly just showing up, again and again, even when you're tired. Especially then. Nobody claps for the version of it that's just exhaustion and grocery runs and bedtime stories read in a voice that's nearly gone. But that's the part that actually matters. That's the part he'll remember, even if he never knows to name it. Julian was quiet for a long moment, looking down into his tea like it held an answer he'd been searching for his whole life. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost all its boardroom polish entirely. "I don't think anyone has ever shown up for me like that," he said. "Not once that I can remember. I used to watch other kids get picked up from school and try to memorize what it looked like, the way their parents' faces changed the second they spotted them in the crowd. Like if I studied it hard enough, I could borrow it somehow. I never figured out how. I've spent my whole life looking for a reason to come home," he said finally, voice low, rough at the edges. "Can I—" He stopped. Started again, steadier. "Can I be the man who comes home to you? To both of you?" The kitchen was quiet except for the rain against the window and the small, steady sound of my own heartbeat. And underneath the thinning citrus of my blockers, I felt my real scent finally surface. Soft vanilla, warm Earl Grey, something I hadn't let anyone smell in over a decade, and watched Julian's whole body go still, reverent, like he'd just been handed something he didn't fully believe he was allowed to keep. "It's late," I said, voice unsteady. "Stay. We have the whole weekend." He stayed. Saturday broke clear and cold, a rare gift of sun breaking through Vancouver cloud cover, and we took Leo to Stanley Park with a kite shaped like a dragon that Julian had insisted on buying from a corner shop, despite having clearly never flown one in his life. The park smelled like wet cedar and salt off the inlet, that particular Vancouver smell of rain that has only just stopped, everything washed clean and faintly steaming where the sun caught it. Julian wore a jacket I'd never seen before, ordinary, soft at the elbows, nothing like the armor of suits I'd grown used to, and something about seeing him out of that armor entirely, hair mussed by wind instead of product, made him look closer to his own age than I'd ever seen him in the office. Younger, unfinished in a way that suited him. "You're doing it wrong," I told him, watching the kite nosedive into the grass for the fourth time. Julian Vance, billionaire, board-meeting tyrant, true alpha, chasing after it across the lawn like a man wrestling an actual dragon. "This thing is defeating me," he called back, breathless, hauling the kite up by its string like a man wrestling an actual dragon. Leo shrieked with laughter from his perch on my hip, delighted by the spectacle, and when the kite finally caught air and climbed, wobbling ungainly but airborne, Julian turned back to look at us with an expression of such pure, startled joy that something in my chest simply gave way entirely, no more resistance left in it. We bought ice cream from a cart by the seawall. Too much of it. Julian ordering one of everything, like a man making up for 32 birthdays he'd never properly celebrated, and walked the long way around, past the totem poles and the gray-green water, Leo's small hand tucked into Julian's large one like it had always belonged there. By Sunday, the three of us moved through my small apartment with an ease that frightened me a little in the quiet hours after lunch. Julian on the kitchen floor stacking blocks into towers, Leo gleefully demolished, flour on his sleeves from an ambitious and only partially successful attempt at pancakes, laughing at himself in a way I imagined the boardroom had never once seen. That night, after Leo had finally gone down, story read twice, water requested once, the usual negotiations of toddler bedtime, I found Julian standing in the kitchen doorway, watching the dark window like it held something he was afraid to look away from. "You're already a natural at this," I told him, leaning against the counter, watching 32 years of careful loneliness sit a little lighter on his shoulders than it had on Friday. "I don't want this weekend to end," he admitted, low, honest in a way I imagined he rarely allowed himself to be. "I don't want to go back to the empty house tomorrow." "You don't have to," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in years. "Come to career day with us." Something in his face cracked open, gentle and total, like sun finally breaking all the way through Vancouver cloud cover. Monday morning was Father's Day, and the small gymnasium of Leo's preschool smelled like crayons and cafeteria coffee and construction paper. Parents clustered in folding chairs, while small children proudly introduced their families to teachers who'd seen 100 versions of this same scene and somehow still found it moving every time. Outside, the rain had finally let up for good, thin sunlight slanting through the high windows and catching dust motes over rows of finger paintings tacked to a corkboard wall, each one labeled in careful, wobbling crayon letters with a name and the word My Family. Julian had arrived early, nervous in a way I'd never seen him in a boardroom, smoothing down a tie he'd clearly debated wearing at all before settling on the plainest one he owned, like he understood instinctively that this was not a room that wanted to be impressed. Leo pulled Julian by the hand towards Miss Alvarez with the swaggering confidence of a boy presenting his greatest treasure. "This is Julian," Leo announced, beaming, chocolate truffle memories clearly still vivid in his small, proud face. "He fixed my truck." Miss Alvarez looked between the three of us, me in my one good cardigan, Leo glowing with pride, Julian Vance standing in a school gymnasium in a suit that cost more than the building's annual budget, looking, for the first time since I'd met him, entirely undefended, and smiled the warm, knowing smile of someone who recognized a family when she saw one, regardless of how it had been assembled. "It's lovely to meet you," she said. And Julian, billionaire, true alpha terror of the 17th floor, actually blushed, ducking his head with a softness no boardroom would ever believe existed in him. Later, while Leo dragged Julian off to show him a finger-painting display with a single-minded determination only a 3-year-old possesses, I caught Julian's eye across the gymnasium and felt the whole improbable, impossible week of it settle into something that finally felt like it might be permanent. I crossed the room, slipped my hand into his, felt him go warm and still beside me, sandalwood and cedar settling soft and grounding against the vanilla and Earl Grey scent I no longer had any reason to hide. "Happy Father's Day, honey," I murmured, close enough that only he could hear it. "I know you've always wanted to be a father." Julian Vance, orphan, billionaire, the loneliest man I had ever met in an elevator on a Monday morning that felt like 100 years ago, looked down at me with his whole carefully guarded heart finally entirely undone, and didn't say anything at all. He didn't need to. I felt the answer in the way his hand tightened around mine, steady, certain, like something that had finally, after 32 years, found its way home. Epilogue, 1 year later. The photo sits on Julian's desk now, framed in simple dark wood between the quarterly reports and the executive calendar nobody dares schedule over on Saturdays anymore. 3 people on a seawall in Stanley Park, sun breaking rare and golden through gray cloud, a dragon kite caught mid-flight in the background. Leo's missing one front tooth in the picture, gap-toothed and grinning, perched on shoulders that have never once let him fall. Visitors to the 17th floor sometimes ask about it, expecting some corporate parable about work-life balance. Julian just smiles, an easy thing now, worn soft with use, and tells them it's the best deal he ever closed. He still keeps the little red fire truck on the corner of his desk, wheels spinning true. Some things, once fixed, are worth keeping close. The end.